April 14, 1912. The RMS Titanic carries 2,223 people into the North Atlantic night. Passengers, crew, dreamers, immigrants, millionaires. The ship has lifeboats for 1,178. The arithmetic is simple. The consequences were not. When the Titanic struck an iceberg at 11:40 p.m., the evacuation became a geometry problem with no solution. There were not enough seats. There had never been enough seats, and the gap was a choice, legal and deliberate. The ship exceeded every regulation of its time, carrying 20 lifeboats when the law demanded only 16. The White Star Line could claim compliance with British maritime law, and any inspector reviewing the vessel would have agreed. The numbers matched the requirements. The requirements, written in 1894 for ships a fifth the Titanic's size, had simply stopped accounting for progress. 2,223 aboard, 1,178 seats. In the weeks that followed, two nations convened inquiries to answer a single question. How was this allowed? The American investigation opened in New York on April 19th, barely 4 days after the survivors stepped off the rescue ship Carpathia. Senator William Alden Smith subpoenaed Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line, before he could leave port. The British inquiry followed in May, presided over by Lord Mersey in London, with testimony stretching into July. Both inquiries sought the same answers. They did not arrive at the same conclusions. The transcripts run to thousands of pages. Ship designers, officers, survivors, regulators. Witnesses described the ship's course, the ice warnings, the loading procedure. They debated signal rockets and watertight doors, and whether the band played ragtime or hymns as the bow tilted forward. The inquiries examined speed, seamanship, wireless procedure, class divisions. They identified failings in training, communication, abandoned ship protocols. They built complex narratives of errors, compounding across 2 hours and 40 minutes. The mathematics of the disaster remained unchanged. 2,223 aboard, 1,178 seats. Approximately 1,500 people would die. This was a catastrophe shaped by a rulebook, and the rulebook had a history. It had authors, amendments, advisory committees. It had proponents who insisted the regulations were adequate, and critics who had warned they were not. The laws governing lifeboats on British ships were not secrets or oversights. They were deliberate policy, written, debated, and reviewed. In 1911, a year before the Titanic sailed, regulators acknowledged the rules were outdated. They did not change them. The disaster was forensic in structure, a sequence of knowable decisions producing a predictable outcome. Proposals for more lifeboats had been drafted and rejected. Engineers designed davits capable of holding double the installed number. Cost was not the barrier. The Titanic's construction budget was essentially unlimited. Aesthetics mattered. Deck space mattered. Regulatory compliance mattered. The perception of safety, reinforced by advanced watertight compartments and a reputation for indestructibility, mattered. The actual capacity to evacuate every soul aboard did not matter enough. What follows is the procedural history of that gap, the regulations that defined it, the designers who proposed to close it, the decisions that left it open, the night it turned lethal, and the inquiries that assigned its blame. This is a story of incentives, not villains. It is a systems failure dissected in courtroom testimony, ship blueprints, and mortality statistics. The focus here is forensic. The laws, the ships, the evacuation, the aftermath. The Titanic sank because 5 of its 16 watertight compartments flooded, a breach beyond its design tolerance. But 2,223 people boarded a vessel with lifeboat capacity for 1,178 because the law said that was acceptable, and no one with the authority to change the law chose to do so in time. This is how that happened. The problem began with a formula created for a different era. In 1894, the British Parliament passed the Merchant Shipping Act, a comprehensive overhaul of maritime safety regulations. Among its provisions was a new system for lifeboat requirements, designed to replace the patchwork of older rules that had accumulated across decades. The architects of the law faced a question: how many lifeboats should a ship carry? They chose tonnage as the answer. The ship's size in gross registered tons would determine the minimum number of boats required. The logic had practical appeal. Larger ships carried more passengers, so scaling lifeboat requirements to tonnage created a rough proxy for capacity. The system defined brackets. A ship between 5,000 and 10,000 tons needed a certain number of boats. A ship above 10,000 tons, the largest category the law recognized, needed 16 lifeboats under davits, providing a minimum of 9,625 cubic feet of capacity. That translated to space for approximately 960 people. The regulations assumed 10,000 tons represented the upper limit of shipbuilding. In 1894, that assumption was reasonable. The largest passenger liners of the era hovered near or below that threshold, and the law's framers built their brackets to match the fleet they governed. Then, shipbuilding accelerated. By 1912, the White Star Line's Titanic displaced 46,328 gross registered tons, nearly 5 times the maximum tonnage the 1894 law had contemplated. The ship could carry over 3,300 people at full capacity. On its maiden voyage, it carried approximately 2,200. The law still demanded 16 lifeboats. The Titanic exceeded the requirement, installing 14 standard wooden lifeboats, 2 wooden cutters, and 4 collapsible boats. The total capacity came to 11,327.9 cubic feet, space for 1,178 people. White Star Line could point to those 20 boats and claim compliance, even generosity. The law had stopped counting at 10,000 tons. The Titanic weighed more than 46,000. The gap was structural. Tonnage-based regulations created a ceiling, a point beyond which additional ship size triggered no additional safety requirements. A 10,000-ton ship needed 16 boats. A 15,000-ton ship needed 16 boats. A 46,000-ton ship needed 16 boats. The formula worked when ships stayed near the bracket's upper edge, when 10,000 tons remained close to the industry's maximum. It failed the moment shipbuilding outpaced the law. By 1912, the Titanic sailed under rules written for vessels a fraction of its size, carrying more than twice as many people as its lifeboats could hold. The regulations were outdated when the ship launched, and that obsolescence was knowable, measurable, and unaddressed. This was the rulebook. It had been on the books for 18 years. The Titanic met the law's requirements and exceeded them. 20 lifeboats lined the deck. Those 14 wooden boats, the 2 cutters, the 4 collapsibles arranged under davits along the ship's flanks. Inspectors could count them, measure their cubic capacity, verify the total against the regulations. The law demanded 16 boats for any vessel over 10,000 tons. The Titanic carried 20. By the standards written into the Merchant Shipping Act, the ship complied. More than complied, it demonstrated a margin of safety beyond the legal minimum. The numbers told a different story. The ship left Southampton on April 10, 1912, carrying approximately 2,223 people passengers across 3 classes, crew working the engines and staterooms and kitchens. That number represented less than the ship's designed capacity, which exceeded 3,300 at full passenger load. The Titanic was sailing below maximum capacity, a maiden voyage with empty berths. The arithmetic was knowable before the ship cleared port. 2,223 people aboard. Space in the boats for 1,178. The gap measured 1,045 souls, roughly 47% of everyone on the ship. If every lifeboat launched at full capacity, if the loading proceeded without error, without confusion, without anyone refusing to leave the warm deck for a small boat suspended over black water, the best possible outcome still left more than 1,000 people with nowhere to go. That outcome assumed perfection. Evacuations do not proceed perfectly. White Star Line could defend the numbers. From a regulatory perspective, the gesture appeared generous. From a capacity perspective, it changed nothing fundamental. 16 boats provided space for 960 people. 20 boats provided space for 1,178. The ship still carried nearly twice as many people as the lifeboats could hold. The extra 4 boats narrowed the gap from catastrophic to slightly less catastrophic. Enough to claim compliance with a margin, not enough to evacuate the ship. The Titanic was legal. It was also, by the metrics that mattered on the night of April 14th, lethally under-equipped. The problem was not a secret. In April 1911, the Board of Trade wrote to its own advisory committee on merchant shipping, acknowledging that existing lifeboat regulations needed revision to address requirements for larger ships. The rules covered vessels up to 10,000 tons. Modern passenger liners had surpassed that threshold years earlier, and new construction continued to push size upward. The letter requested guidance on updating the brackets. The committee met. It discussed. Months passed. Alexander Carlisle sat on that committee. He had spent decades at Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard building the White Star Line's fleet, rising to managing director before retiring in 1910. The Titanic was his final design. He understood both sides of the problem, the ship's specifications and the regulations meant to govern it. He watched the committee debate procedural questions while the ship moved toward completion in Belfast slipways. Nothing changed. The delays had explanations. Regulatory revision required consultation, drafting, parliamentary approval. Maritime industries operated internationally, and unilateral British changes risked complications for ships registered elsewhere or trading across borders. The existing rules functioned adequately for most vessels. Wholesale revisions carried risks, unintended consequences, disruption to established practices, resistance from ship owners who had built fleets around the current standards. These were institutional reasons, the language of caution and thoroughness. They described a process, the machinery of governance turning slowly when measured action seemed prudent. Later, after the disaster, officials described the tonnage-based system as hopelessly antiquated, a relic unsuited to modern shipbuilding. The assessment was accurate. It was also retroactive. The system's obsolescence had been documented in official correspondence before the Titanic cleared port. The disaster made the failure visible to the public. The failure itself belonged to the year preceding the sinking, when acknowledgement existed and revision did not follow. The regulations were outdated. The Board of Trade knew. The Titanic sailed anyway. The hardware existed to save everyone. Alexander Carlisle designed the davits for the Olympic-class liners, the metal frames and winches extending from the ship's sides, the mechanical infrastructure that would lower lifeboats from deck to water. He understood the system's geometry, how many boats each davit could support, how much weight they could handle, how the equipment might evolve as regulations changed. He built flexibility into the specifications, Each davit could deploy 4 lifeboats. The ship installed enough davits to support 48 boats, potentially more if the spacing allowed. Carlyle calculated the capacity. 48 boats at full utilization would provide space for everyone aboard, passengers and crew, with margin to spare. The davits stood ready for that load. Carlyle had spent decades at Harland and Wolff, the Belfast shipyard that built White Star's fleet. He rose to managing director, oversaw construction of the largest passenger liners in the world, and understood both engineering and maritime regulation. When he designed the Titanic's davits, he anticipated that the Board of Trade would eventually update its lifeboat requirements to match the scale of modern ships. The davits represented forethought, hardware designed for a future regulatory regime that would demand more boats as tonnage increased. The equipment could handle it. The structure was ready. The ship left the slipway with 20 lifeboats. The rejection came down to priorities. The Titanic was a vessel built for luxury as much as transportation, a floating showcase of Edwardian opulence designed to compete with Cunard's newest ships. Deck space mattered. First-class passengers expected promenades, open expanses where they could walk without navigating around rows of lifeboats. Aesthetics influenced every design decision, from the grand staircase to the arrangement of boat deck. More lifeboats meant visual clutter, equipment occupying space passengers would use for leisure. Carlyle retired in June 1910, while the Titanic was still under construction. The ship was his final design, the last vessel to carry his engineering decisions before he left Harland and Wolff. The davits remained, installed and operational, capable of supporting more than double the lifeboats actually fitted. They worked exactly as designed when the ship sank, lowering boats into the North Atlantic with mechanical precision. They simply had too few boats to lower. The capacity to save everyone existed in the equipment. The decision to not use that capacity belonged to the shipping line, a choice of promenades over evacuation margin, aesthetics over arithmetic. Thomas Andrews built the Titanic with resources that erased most constraints. As chief naval architect at Harland and Wolff, Andrews oversaw every aspect of the ship's construction, from hull plates to interior paneling. White Star Line gave him what designers rarely receive: a budget described as carte blanche, instruction to spare no expense in making the vessel the finest afloat. The phrase used later was "no money spared in her construction." Andrews translated that freedom into engineering decisions shaped by both luxury and safety, a ship meant to impress passengers and withstand maritime hazards. The watertight compartment system represented his approach. 16 compartments divided the hull, each sealed by doors operable from the bridge. The design allowed the ship to remain afloat if up to 4 compartments flooded, a tolerance beyond anything required by regulation or common practice. The system was sophisticated, expensive, and built into the ship's fundamental architecture. It made the Titanic extraordinarily resilient by the standards of 1912. He understood the arithmetic. The ship could carry over 3,300 people at capacity. The 20 boats installed provided space for 1,178. The davits Carlyle designed could support them. The budget could absorb the cost. The decision came down to White Star, not Andrews. He designed what the company ordered, worked within priorities established by ownership rather than setting them himself. Andrews built the finest ship he could within the parameters given. Those parameters did not prioritize evacuating everyone aboard. Andrews sailed on the maiden voyage, occupying first-class cabin A36 on A deck. He conducted inspections, monitored systems, observed how the ship performed under operational conditions. When the Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14th, Andrews assessed the damage within minutes. 5 compartments flooding. The ship could survive 4. He understood immediately what that meant. The vessel would sink, and the timeline was measurable. The watertight compartment system worked as designed. It simply could not compensate for damage exceeding its tolerance. Andrews died in the sinking. The ship he built to be extraordinarily safe succeeded in its design goals and failed in ways those goals did not account for. The watertight compartments delayed the sinking but could not prevent it. The lifeboat capacity proved catastrophically insufficient. His engineering was sound. The priorities shaping what he was asked to build belonged to others. The final decision belonged to J. Bruce Ismay. As chairman of the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, which owned the White Star Line, Ismay controlled the priorities, shaping how the Titanic would be built. Carlyle designed davits that could hold 64 lifeboats. Ismay approved 20 boats, the number that exceeded legal requirements while preserving the deck arrangements White Star wanted. White Star maintained a particular stance toward classification. The company never submitted its ships to Lloyd's Register, the independent organization that assessed vessel safety and construction standards. White Star's position, stated in company materials, was that their ships were far in excess of any of those requirements, implying that external certification was unnecessary for vessels built to their standards. The stance proclaimed confidence in the company's engineering, while avoiding outside scrutiny of design choices like lifeboat capacity. The confidence had a foundation. The Titanic was extraordinarily safe by measures that mattered: watertight compartments, double bottom, sophisticated pumping systems, advanced construction techniques. A 1910 publicity brochure described the Olympic-class liners as designed to be unsinkable, as far as it is possible to do so. The qualifier mattered. The claim was about design intent and engineering capability, not an absolute guarantee. The Shipbuilder magazine, in a 1911 article detailing the ship's features, concluded they were practically unsinkable. The word practically often disappeared when the phrase entered popular discourse. Harland and Wolff later maintained the ship was never advertised as unsinkable outright, attributing the myth to public interpretation of technical coordination. Most seamen never participated. Many lacked rowing experience. Lifeboat was maritime tradition, not legal requirement, a protocol without standardized enforcement procedures. Officers interpreted the instruction according to their own judgment. On the Titanic, that judgment varied by officer, and the variation created measurably different outcomes for passengers on port versus starboard. Second Officer Charles Lightoller supervised lifeboat loading on the port side. His interpretation of women and children first meant women and children only. Male passengers were excluded unless needed as crew to row the boats. Lightoller enforced the rules strictly, even when boats had empty seats and no additional women or children stood nearby waiting to board. Several portside lifeboats left the ship partially filled because Lightoller would not allow men into vacant spaces. He operated under a plan he believed would maximize capacity. Load boats lightly from the boat deck, then fill them to full capacity once in the water by accessing passengers through lower deck gangway doors. The plan assumed the gangway doors could be opened and boats maneuvered to collect additional passengers after launch. The assumption failed. As the ship listed and sank deeper, the gangway doors became submerged or inaccessible. Boats that left partially filled remained partially filled. The result: fewer men survived from the port side, and lifeboat capacity was underutilized due to procedural rigidity. First Officer William Murdoch supervised the starboard side. His interpretation of women and children first prioritized women and children, but allowed men to board if seats remained available after all nearby women and children had embarked. Murdoch focused on filling boats to capacity rather than enforcing exclusive gender rules. If a boat had space and no women or children were immediately present, men could board. The first lifeboat launched from the Titanic was Lifeboat Number 7 under Murdoch's supervision at approximately as maximizing lives saved, with gender priority enforced until no women or children remained nearby. Neither officer had training or guidelines specifying how to handle partially filled boats or vacant seats. They made decisions in real time based on maritime tradition, personal judgment, and assumptions about how the evacuation would proceed. The choice between measured in survival statistics. The numbers. First-class women survived at approximately 97%. Third-class men survived at less than 14%. First-class passengers overall had a survival rate exceeding 62%. Third-class passengers overall survived at roughly 24%. The gap reflected location, information access, and the time required to navigate a ship not designed for rapid movement between class areas. First-class passengers received information quickly. Crew knocked on cabin doors. Stewards provided updates. The proximity to officers and boat deck meant awareness spread efficiently. Many first-class passengers reached lifeboats early when boats were loading and spaces available. Third-class passengers faced structural disadvantages. They occupied the lowest decks, requiring navigation through multiple levels, corridors, and stairwells to reach boat deck. Physical barriers called Bostwick gates separated third-class areas from second- and first-class sections. These gates existed to enforce class segregation during the voyage. During evacuation, they became impediments. Some gates were locked, others manned by crew enforcing separation. Language compounded the problem. Many third-class passengers were immigrants who spoke limited or no English. Instructions shouted in English meant nothing to families who spoke Italian, Swedish, Arabic, or any of the other languages represented in steerage. The lack of translators or multilingual crew meant confusion where clarity was critical. Whether crew deliberately held third-class passengers below decks remained disputed in testimony. Some witnesses described crew preventing movement upward, maintaining barriers, even as the ship tilted. Other testimony suggested crew worked to guide third-class passengers toward upper decks, but lacked coordination or clear routes for moving hundreds of people through an unfamiliar ship in darkness and rising panic. Another ship sat within sight. The SS Californian, a cargo vessel, had stopped for the night in an ice field roughly 5 to 10 nautical miles from the Titanic's position. Captain Stanley Lord had ordered the engines halted rather than risk navigating through ice in darkness. The ship sat idle, crew on watch, waiting for dawn when conditions would allow safe movement. Between 12:45 a.m. and 2 a.m., Californian crew observed white rockets rising into the sky. Multiple officers reported the sightings to Captain Lord. The rockets came from the direction of a ship visible on the horizon, a vessel the Californian's crew had been watching since earlier in the evening. Captain Lord was informed. He questioned whether the rockets were distress signals. He suggested they might be company signals, a form of communication between ships operated by the same line, or signals from a third ship not visible to the Californian. He ordered crew to attempt contact via Morse lamp. The lamp signals went unanswered. The Californian's wireless operator had gone off duty and was asleep. The ship's single radio operator worked shifts, not continuously. No one was listening when the Titanic sent its distress calls. No one woke the operator to check for radio traffic after the rockets were observed. Captain Lord ordered no immediate investigation. hoists. The operation took hours. By morning, 713 survivors stood on the Carpathia's decks, though some records state 705, depending on how deaths during or immediately after rescue were counted. The ship that had carried its own passengers and crew now carried additional hundreds, people pulled from lifeboats after spending hours exposed to freezing temperatures. Rostron received recognition, reflecting the contrast with Captain Lord's inaction. Congress awarded him a gold medal. Maritime organizations and governments honored his decision to navigate ice at speed, to risk his own ship and passengers for a vessel in distress. The recognition was not solely for technical seamanship. It acknowledged the choice to act immediately when distress was confirmed, the willingness to accept danger to provide aid. The Carpathia brought survivors to New York, arriving April 18th to crowds and press. The ship became part of the story, not for what went wrong, but for what went right, after disaster struck a captain who diverted course without hesitation, a crew that prepared for rescue, a vessel that reached the scene and completed the work of saving everyone still alive to be saved. One ship sat close and did nothing. Another ship, farther away, came at full speed. The contrast defined much of how the maritime community and public understood accountability when the inquiries convened. Senator William Alden Smith convened the U.S. Senate inquiry on April 19, 1912, the day after the Carpathia arrived in New York with survivors. The hearings began in New York and later moved to Washington, D.C. Smith served J. Bruce Ismay with a subpoena to ensure the White Star Line chairman remained available for testimony. That owned the ship. ability at the value of the ship and cargo after loss. If the Titanic's value underwater was minimal, the law potentially shielded White Star from compensating victims beyond a nominal sum. The inquiry's findings would influence whether that legal protection would hold, or whether public pressure and evidence of negligence might create pathways for greater accountability. Senator Smith was not a maritime expert. He asked questions about watertight compartments, ice navigation, and lifeboat procedures, with the bluntness of someone unfamiliar with technical conventions. Industry witnesses found the questioning frustrating, sometimes absurdly uninformed. Smith did not relent. He documented testimony, preserved contradictions, and created a public record that newspapers covered extensively. The inquiry was theatre as much as investigation, a reckoning conducted in public, with survivors and victims' families watching from galleries. The American inquiry concluded that blame belonged to multiple parties: the captain for not slowing despite ice warnings, the company for insufficient lifeboats, the Board of Trade for outdated regulations, Captain Lord for ignoring rockets. The findings spread responsibility across system and individuals, regulatory failure and personal judgment. Lord Mersey convened the British Wreck Commissioner's inquiry in London on May 2, 1912, 3 weeks after the American proceedings began. The hearings ran through July 3rd, with a final report issued July 30th. The British inquiry operated under different legal frameworks and political pressure. Jurisdiction Board of Trade, investigating a disaster shaped by the Board of Trade's own regulatory failures. The inquiry examined lifeboat capacity, crew training, and safety standards, all areas where Board of Trade regulations had proven inadequate. Expecting the agency to condemn itself openly was, in Lightollah's view, naive. The inquiry produced findings that acknowledged problems while distributing blame broadly enough to avoid devastating any single institution. The British inquiry differed from the American proceedings in tone and target. The US Senate inquiry had been aggressive toward individuals and companies, willing to assign personal responsibility and recommend sweeping changes. The British inquiry was protective of industry and government, focused on procedural failures while avoiding strong condemnation of specific people or entities beyond Captain Lord. Both inquiries agreed on key facts: insufficient lifeboats, excessive speed, the Californians' failure to respond. They diverged on how to interpret those facts within their respective legal and cultural contexts. The American inquiry treated the disaster as evidence of negligence requiring accountability. The British inquiry treated it as a tragic result of systemic issues requiring measured reforms. The inquiries produced reports, recommendations, and political theatre. They established official narratives about what happened, assigned degrees of fault, and suggested changes to prevent recurrence. The International Convention for the Safety of Life at Sea, SOLAS, emerged from the disaster and the inquiry's findings. New regulations mandated sufficient lifeboats for all aboard, continuous wireless operation, regular lifeboat drills, and ice patrols in the North Atlantic. The inquiries did not bring criminal charges. They did not financially ruin White Star Line. They did not end any careers except through reputation. What they accomplished was documentation, detailed public records of testimony, technical analysis, and official conclusions about how a ship proclaimed unsinkable went down on its maiden voyage.